So as I was saying to girlfriends, and they would ask me, so what are you working on now? And in the early days, I would say, well, it's a story, and this kid gets hit by a car, and my girlfriends would be like, I'm out. I cannot read a book where anything happens to a kid. And my answer that I began to realize that I needed to format was, it happens right in the beginning. It happens before you meet the boy. It's the premise for the book. It's the moment that impacts the family, but the book is really about the part that I'm fascinated with, and that's the coming together. That's the after part. That's how we do pick ourselves up, even though we don't know how we're going to find the strength some nights and some mornings. And we put it back together. We make it work, and families come together, they are broken apart, and they're annealed. And usually 9 times out of 10, 99.9% of the veterans that I've met in the military hospitals and the rehab hospitals are the most incredible people with the most fortitude, with the least resources, and have the greatest capacity to say, I'm going to make this work. I'm going to walk again on these 2 stumps of legs. Or I'm going to roll out of here and I'm going to show them that everything they told me was wrong. And I am fascinated with this because in my side of the road and in my journey, what I have learned more than anything else is we are imbued with the most incredible sense of resilience. And sometimes we have to find it in the darndest of ways. And I hope that you never really have to tap down and find out what you're made of. But when you do, you will be amazed at what the human spirit can do. And I'm going to guess, in a room full of women, most of you probably have already had to tap into that at some level. But this book is really about the ability of the human spirit to ultimately triumph. At the same time that this book was being written, I had a really good friend whose son was dying from neuroblastoma cancer. And that was, I started the book when I thought her son was going to be okay. But there are moments in the book when Maura, the mother, is describing to her, to finally, I don't want to blow it for you guys who haven't read it, but there's a moment where she's describing her son and how he passed away and what gives her comfort. And that moment really came from my friend Gretchen describing to me as her son died in her arms when they took him home, what happened at that last moment, how he opened his eyes and reached for something with this big beatific smile, and that's the thing that allows her to, to get up every day, that she felt like, as hard as his little life was at the end, that he was going to some place that was even more beautiful and wonderful than where he had been with her. The book is dedicated to Liam, and right before, in about 5 minutes, I always like to just do a little fun thing to remember Liam. There's a dream sequence in the book, and I don't want to take the time to read it because I want to make sure that we get out of here in time to answer questions, but it's one of my favorite parts, and I fought hard with the publisher to keep it in there. My publisher was a young 30-something with no children. There were a few moments in the book. There's a scene where James, who's the boy who dies, his brother, who's a few years younger, comes into the bed with his mom and basically says that thing that all of our kids ultimately ask us is, Mommy, I don't want you to die. I'm going to miss you. And I remember her writing in the red line next to the first draft, would a kid really say this? And I was like, yes, they would. Okay, right, you don't have children. I'm going to have to watch your notes very carefully. But the dream sequence is James coming back. There's a moment where Maura walks out to the garage, and she's taking the recycling out. And it's cold, and it's Christmas time. And she has issues with her husband long before this has happened. And this is really a story about people taking their eye off the ball. So figuratively, or literally rather, people have taken their eye off the ball. Maura is doing something when her son is hit. The 17-year-old boy, you find out later what's going on there. But literally people, and part of my conceit in writing this is I am so worried about people texting and driving. I am so worried about our children. I'm so worried about all of us. And I sort of took my own Oprah pledge after I wrote this book and said, okay, if I'm going to write a book that has to do with texting and driving, then I am not going to pick my device up and text. And I pass people on the highway, I'm sure you do too, and they're swerving a little, and when I pass them, I see them on their devices. We've all done it. I'm not perfect, but I mean, part of this was to just scare us all straight. Nothing, no instant answer is worth any of this. And I think we need to constantly remind ourselves as we move into this world where our devices become, another appendage for ourselves. So the dream sequence, as Maura walks outside, she makes a decision about her marriage because the book goes through 2 generations. There's Maura and Pete, They're the parents of James, who was hit by the car. And then there are her parents, and that's the next older generation. And there are secrets in that marriage that will be sort of flayed open by this one, moment of impact at the beginning of the book. And it's looking at marriage and relationships from those two different generations. And Margaret, Maura's mother, who's probably about 64, is really one of my favorite characters. She's sort of a combination of a lot of the women in more my mother's age, and my mother's older, she's 80, but Margaret has grown up, well, the Vietnam War and all the hippie stuff was sort of happening on other coasts. Margaret has grown up in a really repressive, small town as a very Catholic girl, so she's missed a lot of that stuff and is 15 years mindset sort of older than she might normally be as a 65-year-old person. But she's the heart and soul of the family. And if she could talk to us, she would say, to all of us, quit your whining and your soul searching and your it's all about meing and your kvetching, and just lace your bootstraps up and get to work, because there are people that need you and there are people in your family. And isn't it wonderful that we all believe that we should always be pursuing our own personal happiness? But sometimes as a woman, when you're responsible for all these other souls, that's not necessarily possible. The dream sequence came from Melanie Bloom, because I remember her saying to me at one point in time, looking at me 3 months after David had died, and said, "Why haven't I dreamed about him? Why hasn't he come to me?" And I remember thinking how hard that would be, to want something so much, to want to see someone again. And so I wrote the dream sequence in a comforting way to kind of be that night where Maura makes a decision when she's out returning the recycling and goes back in the house and then dreams about James. I also wanted to look, bless you, and this is my last point, I also wanted to look at that middle place in marriage. I'm fascinated with that middle place in marriage. I am 52 years old, and most of my friends who weren't stupid enough to have children at 40, kids are leaving the nest. And there's a reevaluation that takes place. Okay, what do I do now? How do I reinvent myself? What will be my next phase? And for a few of my friends who have really examined the desire to pick up your husband's stained underwear once again from the floor 2 inches from the laundry basket for the next 25 years of your life, have decided that perhaps a better match exists on the internet somewhere, and so have blown up their marriages, and probably about 3 or so years later, for at least 2 of the women I can think of, have sort of limped back and said, "I wish that we'd really put our shoulders into it. I wish that I'd tried a little bit harder." And this isn't an homage to marriage, because there are marriages that work and marriages that don't. Marriages have seasons, and so do relationships. But I think in some cases, there's this feeling that there's going to be somebody more perfect out there, somebody who hits every box on our checklist. And in the end, everything new gets old. That little flirty, sort of flippy butterfly feeling we get when we see our husbands, well, that ultimately goes away when we're picking up his dirty underwear. But guess what? Probably it does again and again. So we could spend our lives as Elizabeth Taylor, and that would be great, because she held the purse strings in all those relationships. But I think ultimately we make peace with what we have.